Good afternoon, everyone, or everyone in the UK, and good morning to our virtual audience, some of whom may be in the US. My name is Kelly Wanzer. I am the Executive Director of SilverLining, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our session today here in Glasgow, broadcasting from the COP26 UN Climate Summit. My organization, SilverLining, we focus on near-term climate risk. And for those of you who have been following the intergovernmental process, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued a report this year where they called for a code red on climate change. And part of that is the fact that we're approaching some significant changes in the Earth system that folks are concerned about. And we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of work to do quickly to respond to and address the causes of climate change and some of the consequences that we're starting to see. So my organization works on that problem, and one of the big features of that problem is how quickly we can better understand what the climate system is doing, what impacts we might expect, and what the consequences of different kinds of responses would be. And so we in SilverLining, we're very concerned about how we accelerate progress, as many of the parties here in the IPCC process are too. And in the case of what we understand about the problem, how fast we can accelerate the science. So our conversation today is focused a lot on how we go about learning what we need to know about what the climate system is likely to do, and how well we can understand the impacts, and how well we are equipped to make decisions about how to respond. I'm very honored to have quite a distinguished panel of speakers here to talk about one of the sort of new and disruptive ways that we might be able to accelerate science in this category. And so I'm very pleased first to introduce John Francois Lamarck. John Francois is the Director of Climate and Global Dynamics Laboratory at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the United States. This is one of the centers of excellence for climate modeling and climate research in the world. They're particularly dedicated to open science, and they provide a lot of the scientific tools and data sets that researchers use in the US and around the world. And John Fois is responsible for one of the world's premier climate models called the Community and Earth Systems Model. And so, John Francois, I'm very happy to welcome you here. Hello, how are you?
Hi, Kelly. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. And tell us where you are today.
Well, I'm in Boulder. So, yeah, just going from early morning in Colorado.
We're really interested to hear you talk about the new study that you're doing that involves climate models looking at near-term climate and what that problem looks like. And so could you tell us a little bit about what you do in your research and what you're trying to do with this particular effort you're in now?
So what we're trying to do is to use the class of models that you were mentioning that are being used for reports like the IPCC assessment report. So there are a lot of the research that is presented and used in those is to use those Earth system models. So those Earth system models are really used under a variety of scenarios and options for the future. And so what we try to do here is to look at all potential aspects within the limits of what we can represent and we know how to represent in an Earth system model, which is always based on as much observations as we can, learning how the system works from the real world and applying it into an Earth system model. But then we can ask questions of what if. So what we have in particular done over this last round is really trying to capture the whole depth of the atmospheric response. And I will go into this a little bit further. We obviously consider all aspects of the Earth system, but the one thing that we really want to do is to capture all aspects of the atmospheric response, because it will be very different at different altitudes, and there are very different signals that we can look from the observational record on the existing change from the most recent climate change over the last, say, 20 years.
And just to level set, John Francois, the study that you're using the climate models for is looking at what are you trying to, what period are you studying, and what problems are you trying to address?
So a lot of the IPCC focuses on the whole 21st century. However, I think there is a real need to focus on the next 20, 30, 50 years, because that's really also at the essence of what might need to get done to really affect the policies, the policies, and the very effective policies that we hope can be put in place. We will start seeing those changes over the next decade, and also some of the potential risk. If we don't do anything, we'll also start realizing in probably the second half of this century. So I think there is a lot to be learned on what are the potential risks into the next decades, and then what are the different scenarios telling us into the reduction in risk if we start implementing different strategies. Solar climate intervention is one of them, and some of the discussions that are going on right now at COP on reducing greenhouse gases, and especially methane, would have very significant impact already over the next few decades. So my focus, and especially in the project that we'll be discussing here, is over the next few decades.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So you're using the climate models to look at the next few decades and to try to determine what will happen in all different parts of the system in all different parts of the world?
That's right. And so one thing that, as you can see from the right hand side here of this figure, is that what we really do is we look at the full globe. So we can capture not only the global response, the standard global surface temperature change that people are probably most familiar with, but we also capture regional changes. So we can actually identify what is the likelihood of a change over a specific region. The model is not is too coarse in its resolution to do local, but regional to global. We have some confidence, and we can have statistical analysis that would give us some confidence of how the model is doing and what is the likelihood of a certain response to a different strategy, for example.
Well, that sounds great. So
and yeah, so this is the perfect eye candy. So this is what comes out of the model. I mean, what comes out of the model is huge amounts of data that we can then visualize. This is a total amount of moisture that's present in the atmosphere. And so you can start seeing the features that are represented in such an Earth system model are very much realistic and represent the system as we have it. You can probably see here some large storms going on, some tropical cyclones traveling through. So this is what an Earth system does. It computes this whole state of the atmosphere every 30 minutes. That's what we do. This model is that now we can do those calculations, and we have been doing some of those analysis, some of those simulations on Amazon Web Services cloud computing, and that will be, in my mind, really changing the way we can do climate science, because the amount of data that we generate, which is it's we're requiring huge amounts of this. This generates about 300, one simulation focusing on the next 50 years, for example, they will generate about 300 terabytes of data, right? And then we need people to be able to look at that, and this is where having data sitting in the clouds and sitting on Amazon Web Services will, in my mind, really democratize the way science is being done, and will really help people understand what are the potential risks and what are the potential mitigations that could be done under different scenarios.
So taking a step back, John Francois, you're at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is one of the central places where they run these giant climate models. How do you do it now? How does it work now?
So what we do now is we have our own supercomputer on which we perform the simulations, and then we have to find a way of distributing the data. So there is something that globally is called the Earth System Grid. And so we can post data, but this is just a place where people can make data available for download. But there is still now the bottleneck of performing the analysis that still has to be done locally. There is no way you can use the Earth System Grid to do the explicit analysis, for example. So everyone has to download as much of the data as they need for data analysis. And so I think that really limits what people can do in terms of analyzing those simulations.
So if I want to run a big global climate simulation like you do, I need a supercomputer?
Yes.
And then if I want to look at the data from your simulation, you're saying it's a petabyte of data, it's a huge data set. And then I download that. So there's a link I can go to at NCAR and download that data set. But I'm going to need a big network and a big computer to work with that.
That's right.
I see.
That's right.
And so if I don't have those things, then I'm not going to be able to do that.
That's or you're going to be very limited in the amount of information you can download, and then the amount of information that you can look at. So I think that it's not a complete inability to do, but it's very restrictive because not everyone will have the bandwidth or the capability to store terabytes and terabytes and then sift through it, and so to me that's the step that having access to the cloud should be really interesting to see what kind of new science can get done. As we know, diversity of opinions is critical for looking at those questions. And so we have only been looking probably at a certain specific angles, especially on regional climate change. So that's what I'm really hopeful also to see some really new and interesting science coming out of this.
Well, that's pretty amazing. So, because it sounds like what you're saying is because the access is limited, and people might, even the people who are working this way might struggle a bit or be slowed down by it, that there isn't as much science getting done as there could be. And there aren't as many people as there could be working on these things if they had better access.
Right. I mean, as is being discussed at COP, we have basically a few decades now to make the changes that we need to make. But we need to have the information to make those changes and fully understand what are the implications of those changes and how they can be done. And the more people look at the information that we have available, the more informed the decisions will be made. So I think it is critical to do this, especially now.
Well, thank you, John Francois, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us about it. And
My pleasure.
We're going to come back to you in a little while with some additional questions. as we join in the panel, so we appreciate it. And we're going to turn right now to one of your colleagues in the Global South from the University of Cape Town to sort of talk about the other side of the problem that you're speaking to, which is, what does it look like if you want to do these things, but you don't have the NCAR supercomputer? So thank you, John Francois. We'll see you in a few minutes. And meanwhile, I'm pleased to welcome from the University of Cape Town, Dr. Chris Leonard is a climatologist and member of the research staff at the Climate System Analysis Group at the University of Cape Town. It's a leading climate research center in the world, actually. And Chris was also for the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, which is the most recent one. He was a lead author of the Africa chapter for Working Group 2, and he was also lead author for Chapter 2 of the recent IPCC Special Report on Land and Climate. Chris, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us from South Africa today. And you I wanted to ask you, you started your career as a zoologist. How did you end up in climate system analysis and why?
It was partly a chance encounter with my current boss, Bruce Hewitson, where we met coincidentally. I just finished my master's. I was looking at extinction in birds, and I was wondering what to do now. So he said, well, come and work for me. I've got 6 months. I need you to work on climate change. This was still when CMIP3 was a thing. And I worked for those 6 months with him, and then realized this is actually really important, and stayed with him for a PhD and moved on into climatology and climate science. So that's how that worked. I'm at the moment trying to link my climate science back to my zoology, ecology, biodiversity background. And there are a few things that are really interesting. Having this climate science background with that biodiversity postgraduate study is really cool.
Well, that's terrific. And so in the climate system analysis group, it looks like you guys have, you are interested in what impacts are. And tell us a little bit about your work and the kinds of problems you're trying to look at and the kinds of tools that you use for that.
Yeah, we call ourselves CSAG, Climate System Analysis Group. We're really interested in what the regional impacts of climate change might be. So John Fois showed the global model, and we know from IPCC and everywhere else that we hear about 1.5 and 2 degrees and 3 degrees of global warming, which is politically important. They're politically important figures. But what does 1.5 degrees mean for me in Cape Town, in South Africa? And what does it mean for someone in Bangladesh? And what does it mean for someone in New Zealand? These the regional climate information is more important, we think, than these global averages that are political figures, really. So what we try and understand at CSAG is what are the regional climate changes that are projected to occur over Africa, largely Southern Africa as a focus region. And then how do we communicate what we see in the climate system, these regional changes in the climate system? How do we bring that information to policymakers? So we have in the team, we have a strong physical climate science presence, and we also have a more social science. How do we actually translate this climate data effectively that comes out of the types of models that John Fois described? How do we turn that into something that is usable for a policymaker so that they can understand what potential impacts may occur because of climate change? And then think about how to either adapt to those changes or perhaps even mitigate to reduce emissions. So that's what we're really interested at CSAG, is what are the regional impacts of climate change, and how do we communicate those impacts to the policy community who are going to have to make decisions with that information.
So that's really interesting. So the work that you do and the information that you have is what sort of directly enables your policymakers in South Africa to engage in the sort of both locally in terms of what they're facing potentially and how to plan for the future, and maybe internationally in dialogues like here at COP.
Yeah, that's correct. And we really do try and engage the policy at different levels. So at the regional governance scale, at the provincial scale, at national scales. And then we're also involved in projects where we're working in with various teams in Southern African cities so that we can try and understand how does climate change impact at the city scale, and what are the types of decisions or things that policymakers at the municipal city scale need to be thinking about in this climate change context.
So this problem that John Francois was describing, or the approach where you want to leverage data from these sophisticated climate model simulations to look at impacts and the future picture for South Africa. How does that work for you? Are you able to download the data from John Francois' system? Are you able to run simulations yourself? How does it work?
Yeah, so at CSAG, we're relatively fortunate in that we have computational capacity to run some of these models. We cannot run them the way that Jean Francois described because we don't have a very big computational capacity. And within CSAG and some other institutions in South Africa and some few African countries, there's no real resource to run these types of models. At a university in Johannesburg, the University of Witwatersrand, they have resource. At UCT, we have a little bit of resource. But outside of these very few key centers, there is no infrastructure within the continent to run these types of models because the computers are too big. There's often interrupted power. There's very little bandwidth or relatively small bandwidth. So, for example, into my house here in Cape Town, I have more bandwidth coming into my house than there are in 9 Met services, Southern African Met services. There's a really interesting paper that came out 3 or 4 months ago that showed this. So the infrastructure at many research institutions in Africa and even in developed nations generally, or developing nations, sorry, generally, that infrastructure is lacking to do the type of modeling that Jean-Francois described at the global scale, but then also at the regional scale. So one of the other things at CSAG that we do is something called downscaling, which is going from the global scale, the global climate models, down to the region that you're interested in. So I will downscale from the global scale to, for example, South Africa or to a Bangladesh type of domain where the resolution of the information or the data that we get is much higher. And by that, I use jargon, I mean, in a global model, you usually get one value every, say, 200 kilometers. So for a 200 kilometer grid, you'll get temperature, rainfall, pressure, humidity. And in a place like Cape Town, where we have the ocean, we have mountains, we have flat plains, a 200 kilometer grid is meaningless. It just doesn't tell us anything useful. So when you downscale to a higher resolution, so for example, 22 kilometers, you're going from 200 kilometer grid to a 22 kilometer grid, and you get a higher resolution data. And then that, for example, that comes out of the coordinated regional downscaling experiment that I'm also involved in. So we really want to get at this regional climate data so that we can go through to translating all of that data into something that is useful for policymakers working with these different communities.
So that's really interesting when in the context of a point you made before about the networks and your actual bandwidth. So it sounds like there are 2 problems. You don't have the infrastructure to run the climate models, which means that you sort of have to take whatever simulations are coming from the
Right.
centers like NCAR, whether those are necessarily what you would do. But second,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Perhaps I can use Cordex as an example here, the coordinated regional downscaling experiment, where there is data available online on the Earth Systems Grid Federation for Africa. Africa was a prioritized domain within Codex. And what we had to do at CSAG, I facilitate what's called Codex Africa, where Codex has basically downscaled every global landmass across the world. And what we have to do, it's a lot of data. So what we do here at Cape Town is I download the data from the Earth Systems Grid Federation onto our computers. I then buy, say, 20 external hard drives, put the data onto those hard drives, and then within Codex Africa, we have teams in West, Central, East, and Southern Africa, and we distribute those hard drives out. So that's how within Codex Africa, we get data around. We don't have access, or many of the folk that I work with don't have access to the Earth Systems Grid Federation or bandwidth and capacity to actually download that data themselves. So that's the type of infrastructural challenges that we face within Africa. It's probably a useful example to share.
Well, that sounds like a really difficult challenge, and a really good segue into asking you about how you see the potential of having these activities move onto the cloud, both the model simulations themselves and these data sets that you're shipping around Africa on hard drives.
Yeah. Shipping around hard drives is a bad idea because you can plug it in and it'll fail at any time, particularly in regions where there's not reliable power sources. But how do I see cloud computing? I think it's potentially a game changer for us as developing nation scientists who don't have access to this type of infrastructure. Because what it means is that if you have power, which is not a given all the time, in South Africa, we're undergoing load shedding at the moment. So luckily my light's on. If the light switches off, then you don't have to look at my face. So maybe that's a better thing. But we don't necessarily always have power. And it also assumes bandwidth is there, which again, as I described earlier, is not necessarily very strong bandwidth. So assuming power and assuming bandwidth, having access to a cloud facility where we are able to run a climate model for our particular region is really a game changer, because I think as local researchers, we understand our communities and the questions that our communities and our policymakers are asking. So contrast that with, for example, a northern country who produces a simulation, a downscale simulation or some climate simulation, and just dumps it there and says, okay, use it. Turn it around and say, okay, so we are local researchers. We understand the communities. We understand the questions that our policymakers are asking. So we can design this experiment to address their questions and then run it in the cloud. So we can design a modeling experiment, run it in the cloud, and the more important thing is we can then also analyze that data ourselves with this background that I've described, so that we can do all of this within the cloud, and it really is something that's not been done before. If you can imagine someone sitting in Rwanda or even in South Africa, some universities in South Africa, being able to run a climate model, it's mind-blowing. It's just not possible at the moment on the types of infrastructure that we have. So I think it is potentially a game changer for us, because it helps us determine our experiments, the types of simulations that we want to run for our regions or for our countries.
Well, that's really extraordinary, Chris, and I thank you for sharing that, because I think, I'm here at the Climate Summit in Glasgow, and this problem of both the computing limitations and the access limitations is something that many people aren't aware of, even climate experts, even climate diplomats. And it sounds like it's very directly tied to the ability of both your scientists and your policymakers to explore their own questions, examine information for themselves, and actually develop policy.
Go ahead. Sorry. And it also helps us as developing nation researchers. So if I have PhD students or postdoc students, I can give them access to the cloud and experiment, data that's coming out of an experiment, And they can learn how to analyze data. They can learn how to run models. They can learn how to translate this data into useful information for policy. So it's a major capacity development exercise too, where we're developing researchers in developing nation countries who can answer their policymakers' questions. So it really is it has huge potential to capacitate developing nation scientists to actually do good research, publish in good journals, and get into the academic playing field, because we're really not there yet compared to, say, the US and European and Australian researchers.
Well, that's amazing, because like some other disruptive technologies, if you did have these capabilities, it sounds like you could go pretty quickly.
Yeah, there would be a spin up for sure. But maybe one last example is cell phones. So in developed nations, telephone lines were the thing that everybody had to have a telephone line coming into the house. There was intense infrastructure around those telephone lines and the telephones. In Africa and many other developing nations, we largely leapfrogged telephone lines straight to cell phones. So if we can do that in a computing sense, where we can leapfrog having to build this massive infrastructure to run climate models and perform analyses of massive data sets, but having that in the cloud, it really is as you said, a disruptive, a potentially very disruptive and brilliant type of technology.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Leonard, for sharing this perspective. It's a wonderful segue into talking with our next guest here. So please stay with us, because we're going to bring you back for a bit more dialogue. But this is very hopeful, potentially, in terms of the power of the talent we can unlock in Africa and other parts of the world to work on these problems, as well as giving proper empowerment to the scientists and policymakers to look at these things. So thank you for that. And now we're going to, thanks, Chris. And now we're going to talk to our panelist, who is on the other side of the equation. Come up, Anna. Dr. Anna Pinero. I can't quite get the trill in the name, but Anna is a senior program manager with Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative, or Sustainability Group, and within that, she's the founder and director of the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative, which puts information, Earth system information, on the cloud for access by researchers and others around the world. And Anna was trained as an environmental engineer and earth scientist, so she's coming from the technology sector now, but she understands the science problems that folks are facing. And she spent most of her career as a research scientist at NASA and NOAA. So welcome, Anna. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you already for your support for this kind of work that helps move the ball forward in a new way. So could you tell us a little bit first about what you do at ASDI, what that initiative is, and what your goals are in terms of how you help climate through data and research?
Thank you first for the opportunity to be here and participate in this important conversation. So the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative, or ASDI as we call it, it's an effort that we launched publicly a few years back. And the goal of the program is really to try to understand how we can leverage Amazon's scale and our technology and bring that to the outside world as a way to accelerate innovation and problem solving in the sustainability space. And our primary goal is really to minimize the cost and the time that it takes to get these large data sets that we've been talking about, make them more accessible and easily usable and analyzable, if that's a word, to extract insights. Because the data per se is not really relevant unless we extract knowledge and insights that help us make decisions, right? And that's really the core of what we're trying to do here. So just to step back a little bit, how we decided to create the program and what was the impetus. So the issues we're hearing about today are pretty common, unfortunately. And what we've seen in general, not only just with the scientific community, but broadly, if you go across all the sectors, we have this really difficult challenge that we have more data than ever before. You know, we have more satellites being launched, more models producing data with higher resolution, Internet of Things. All of this data being generated is not necessarily translating into more insights and easier and timely access to data. And it's almost like there's this overwhelming amount of data that is dispersed everywhere. The sizes are, in some cases, very hard to handle. And so the idea here was to realize that the cloud has the potential to actually offer a solution, or at least be part of the solution in leveling the playing field, right? So that everybody around the world, independent of where they are, can have access to the same data sets and the same compute that the big institutions that currently have the ability to do it have. So we structured this program around 3 core areas. The first one is very focused on democratization of data. It's really how we call it. And we work with the community, understand what are foundational data sets that are really critical to innovate in the space, for instance, of climate sciences. And then we engage with the data providers that have those data sets and offer to put their data in the cloud and make it openly available to the world. So we basically cover the costs of storing the data and egressing it if people want to take it out. But what we really want to encourage is this change in the way of thinking of not taking the data out, keeping the data in the cloud and bringing the code to the cloud. So this repetitive effort of acquiring the data, storing it, cleaning it, and doing all of that effort is minimized. We have other components of the program that include providing cloud grants. So if people want to use the cloud to analyze the data, we offset that cost. And a very strong component in promoting knowledge exchange. And that's what we believe. We open the data, we provide compute, we encourage people to share their knowledge. This will hopefully lead to some transformation.
Well, and that's pretty amazing, right? Because I think, you know, people with the internet now, people are getting more used to that, whether it's like Wikipedia or LinkedIn. You know, you have a place to go where the data is maintained, and there's sort of a real efficiency, and then people can focus on how you improve that data, how you grow that data, and less around everyone having to carry their own phone book. Idea, but with the Earth system, which is a massive data space. Mm-hmm. And so you guys have been working a while on bringing these Earth system data sets onto the cloud, but now this particular project that John Francois and Chris were describing involves some models too. Mm-hmm. And so tell us how you became involved with that project and how you think about it and why you're excited about it.
Yes, so we actually first started this collaboration. We were approached by SilverLining and NCAR about providing access to large model data sets, you know, like these data sets generated by the models that John Francois was mentioning, and particularly to make them available to countries in the global south that were having this struggle of accessing the data. So we started those conversations, and we rapidly realized that the potential was much bigger than just making the data available, that there was a key role that we could play in opening the science and promoting more innovation in that space. And so we spent quite a lot of time working together for almost the last year, trying to figure out how to take such a complex model and bring it to the cloud. And this is just because it's the first time NCAR is doing this in this collaboration, the first time we are running in full production a climate model in the cloud. And that's really exciting for us to demonstrate that that's possible, but the potential is gigantic from our perspective, right?
Well, and not just you. John Francois alluded to this before, but this is the first time anyone in the world has run a full production climate model on the cloud.
Right.
And so, and from what I gather from what you're saying and their experiences, it is technically a challenging thing to do. These models are very large, and they require very sophisticated interactions among the components of the models to be successful. And so what was that like for your team at Amazon to take on?
Yeah, it was actually pretty exciting because the teams and the groups we got involved internally from HPC and other groups really took on the challenge to make this happen. I think like every time you do something for the first time, it takes a little bit more effort and time as you figure out how to navigate the system. But I think that's also the value of going through this exercise together, is that now this model will be available in the cloud for others to be able to run. And we also have some kind of a pathway to understand where are the challenges, where are the best practices that we learn through this exercise and we can share with others. So we're very excited about the potential learning curve here.
Well, and that's pretty amazing to overcome that technical hurdle, and then hearing what Chris described in terms of what it might mean for the ability of different kinds of people to use the models in ways that they're interested in is pretty exciting. And it's pretty exciting too with a global service like Amazon that makes that happen almost instantly or very quickly. Obviously, there's some work to do downstream, but it's pretty exciting.
Right, and I feel like that's one of the things that really drives us and excites us about this kind of potential is the abilities for groups like Chris to be able to bring their perspective. And John Fois talked about that, and it's a very critical part of this conversation, is that until now and traditionally, only the big institutions that have access to this high-performance computers have the ability to be at the table and be part of the solution. And although that, of course, is the way it's been and it's positive, it limits the amount of perspectives and diverse ways of looking at the problem. And so since we have to accelerate innovation and start moving this forward, as was said before, the more people have their eyes on the problem and contribute to it, the faster, hopefully, we will move this space. And we're eager to have the cloud in the center of that conversation if it helps.
Well, that's pretty exciting. And it sounds like from what Chris was saying, there are a lot of researchers in Africa and other places who would be really interested in using this. But it does sound like, too, there are some technical considerations. So then how do we also help people use the cloud from a technical perspective and make it, it's not quite sort of Netflix or LinkedIn yet, right?
Right.
So how does that work?
Right, and that's a reality that we have been exploring as we engage more with the community to understand what other challenges they are facing. I think first demonstrating that it's possible is a key thing, and we hope this study will help us demonstrate that. Demonstrate the value. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do it if it doesn't bring value. But then the next step is really to build capacity, right? And to build the cloud skills in the broader community, which now are still, limited. And in that sense, I'm actually really excited with a commitment that AWS made last year to, by 2025, provide cloud computing training to 29 million people around the world. It's
a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, but it's part of this effort to, if the technology is here and it can help us with solutions in problems like this, then we need to build capacity in the research community, but in the other sectors as well to leverage these resources and tools. Because we see this as a part of the enablement process that we can bring to the table.
Well, that's really exciting. And I'm sure there are some climate researchers dialed in as well who will be happy to hear that there might be some technical capacity coming downstream to help enable these things. But also who might be curious about the footprint of the work. So these climate models are massive. And they take a lot of computing to run, and then they generate a lot of data, and that takes a lot of energy. So how do you think about that? How should we think about that in the context of, doing this more on the cloud?
Yeah, that's an important question. So thank you for asking. Yeah, obviously that is something that we hear often, and that's I see that all the cloud providers are very concerned with making sure that they reduce as much as possible their carbon footprint and energy consumption. And what we're seeing that is really promising is that studies are showing that actually running workloads in the cloud are considerably less energy demanding than it is to run in a traditional data center. So actually there was a study that was just done and came out recently by the 451 Research as part of S&P Global Market Intelligence. And it was a study that was commissioned by the AWS, but what they found is they surveyed about 300 organizations in Europe, different businesses, and they found that moving the traditional workloads of those businesses to the cloud on average saved about 80% in terms of energy consumption. And the cloud in general is 3 times more efficient energetically than a traditional data center. AWS actually was shown to be 5 times more efficient. So the potential as we step back for the climate space is that if we are going to need to do this kind of computation, if there's an opportunity to do it in the cloud where we are reducing the amount of energy that is being consumed and the carbon footprint associated with that, I think that's pretty exciting. I will add a few more details specifically on the AWS side. There's different levels of optimization that can be done here that helps us with this, right? There's on one side, because this is their business, AWS is trying to optimize the operations, so there's a lot of innovation happening in terms of how they cool the data centers, how they minimize the use of water and energy, but also in terms of the hardware. They're designing their own hardware so that it's more, these processors are much more efficient in terms of energy usage. So that's the old part about like the actual cloud itself. And then there's still energy that is required to run them, no matter how much you cut, right?
Right.
And there's the option and the availability of renewable energy being part of that. And since Amazon committed to be completely 100% renewable by 2025 or use renewable power, we're pretty excited about that as well. So long way to go, but definitely the direction is the right one, and there's a lot of hope for the cloud to help in this space.
Well, that's really interesting. And I know because you guys do things at such scale and with such focus that you can optimize faster than a lot of others. So it's really interesting to hear that might be a feature as well, especially because from a SilverLining perspective, we're really wanting to see a lot more climate model simulations, a lot more analysis of these data sets and open it up to the world and really get that sort of crowdsourced expertise that we're not tapping today. So it would be very nice if the footprint of that could be really as small as possible.
Right, absolutely. And just to build on that, that's partly also the model that we're trying to build of bringing this copies to the cloud. It minimizes the amount of copies we have all over the world, which have their own footprint as well. So it kind of all adds up.
Right. Well, thank you for that. So I want to take a few minutes to, if we can, we'll see how our technical aspects are going. If we can bring John Francois and Chris back from NCAR and the University of Cape Town. Hi, guys. Are you able to see and hear us, or at least hear us?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, we've been having a really good conversation with Anna, who's pointed out some additional benefits of putting things on the cloud. And so right now, I don't know about everyone watching, but I'm having the impression that this is fantastic. And so now I want to ask you guys the question of, what are the challenges here? So you're involved with a program to run the first ever full production climate model simulation on the cloud, which sounds like from Anna wasn't entirely easy to get up and running. And so I'll start with John Francois first. From your perspective, what now are the challenges to doing more of this kind of work on the cloud?
I mean, we still have to iron out quite a few details. This is, as you say, this is the first time we do this. So we're pushing the system and the way we build the system in ways that we haven't before. So we're still learning. I think there is plenty of room for improvement, optimization. Those are really complicated tools. So I think eventually we might want to try to make them much more user friendly, but I think that's still there's still a long way to go there. So I think there is there's still a need for better understanding how to use all that power that's out there, and there are myriad of ways it can be configured, the number of CPUs, the type of network, the disks. I mean, the size of the parameters is so much bigger than what we usually do, because we usually work on just a handful of systems that we know pretty well. And here there's so much flexibility in terms of cost as well. So I think there is still a lot of exploration. I think there is significant potential. I think there is still room for our own in-house computing. I think for some of the work that we need to do, it cannot be at this point. It's still the best and the fastest way for us to get things done. But at the same time, I think this is a way of increasing the power and the type of simulations that we can perform. So I see it very much as an experiment at this point, and it looks like it's going to be a very successful experiment. But we will have to really have a full understanding of all the parameters to see how it can be done in the future. I'm really interested though to see if it makes it a lot more accessible for people, whichever group around the world who can have the funds to run on something like AWS or other cloud providers. If that improves their ability to do the science they want to do, not just the science that we do, and then we create the data and then they can play with it. Here they can really do the full stream of defining the question that they want to answer, and then set up the model to do the simulations they need to do to answer their questions.
Well, that's a good segue, John Francois, over to Chris in terms of being able to do the simulations and explore the questions you want to do. What do you see as the barriers from your perspective if the technology works?
Probably two. The one is learning to use the technology. So it's really what Jean Francois has just said, where actually teaching Southern scientists to the nuance in running a climate model, because a climate model is not a black box where you just push the button. You need to understand what the model is doing, why the model is doing what it's doing, and a host of other things. So actually training Southern scientists who want to do this type of work in climate modeling, so the actual running of the climate model and what it's doing. And the second challenge, I think, is, as Jean-Francois said during his talk, this is creating petabytes worth of data. So the other challenge for us as Southern scientists then is to learn how to analyze these petabytes of data. So what is the software that we need? What are the different types of code? Excuse me. I really enjoyed Anna's her phrase "code to cloud," and that I think will be really, really important when we get to a place where we actually can start analyzing the data. Is having a code repository in the cloud that is accessible to everybody, and that includes Southern and Northern scientists. So those, I think, are the two key challenges. The one, learning how to use the cloud or how to work in the cloud. And then the second is how to analyze such huge volumes of data.
And I mean, the cool thing about those challenges is that, there are challenges that are created by the opportunity.
Absolutely.
So, people getting to kind of step up a learning curve because they have the tools and capabilities potentially to do that. But you raised another interesting point, which I also wanted maybe to have Anna touch on, which is the collaboration potential of people having their scripts, their algorithms, their tools that they've made, which I was surprised to learn. In SilverLining, we work with a lot of climate researchers. In the closed environment, a lot of researchers, they develop tools and algorithms, they even whole models that they use for one paper or one set of studies, and then they're gone, or they're on a shelf somewhere. And so, so the idea that you would open up this kind of collaboration where people are sharing these capabilities, I would think things would go quite a bit faster.
Sure, so absolutely. That's one of the exciting parts of this, is that, again, just going back to the traditional way we've been doing things behind these firewalls and big high-performance computer centers, national labs, and things like that, it really limits the amount of people that can participate in the collaboration. And once you put it in the cloud, you can indeed control who has access, but it's much easier to open that access if you're interested. So I think the real value that this can bring is, accelerating the innovation, because you have more people collaborating and sharing with each other what they've known, but also build transparency and more trust in the process, because as you put it out there and invest in open science, open data, open source, the ability for reproducibility to be tested and things like that becomes much easier. So that's really promising.
That makes a huge amount of sense and is very exciting. And now we wanted to provide the opportunity for questions. So please ask a question from here in the room. Could you tell us who you are too, please?
Hello, my name is Frida Susidum. I'm the special advisor of the Secretary General of the World Organization of Local Government, local and regional government. And I believe, I believe that the next stage of the whole work we have been doing with the local government, with the policy making at local level, national level, global level, needs to go to a next stage, and it has to go through science and through data. The question is, it's not only how to make it accessible, which is very important, but I go back to what Anna was saying about generating knowledge from it. And then Chris was saying earlier about this kind of material that is provided to the policymakers. The question is, what kind of material is brought to the policymakers, and how can we fulfill this segment for the next stage of action that is absolutely urgent now? Because if the work is not done at the local level, in the territories, with the communities, investing in the communities, raising awareness of the communities, making them, enabling them to take their part of the responsibility of this whole thing that the climate emergency is, we will not fulfill what we have to fulfill. Of course, the industry has its own responsibility, the global governments and national governments as well, but the main thing is in our daily life, in the territories. So my question is, how, to Jean Francois, how can we ensure that the kind of systems that you are working on and the analysis that you will be taking from it makes it more accessible to the local governments to take the right decisions? And also to Chris, how can we ensure that what is requested as material for the decision making is the right one that we are looking for? Because I understand, I have been very excited to listen to the whole session about what is scientists, how the science is helping. But if it doesn't help to get to this, we are not achieving what we are all seeking for. Thank you.
So John Francois, that's a big question, and Chris might have some thoughts too.
That was a great question, and there are many levels to this, and but I'll try to limit it to basically the concept of co-design, and I think what we really have to embrace is from the scientific side is to get from people like you and Chris the understanding of on the ground what is the information that is needed. We might be limited in what we can offer, and so our tendency has been to offer what we know we can offer, but it might not be sufficient, or maybe there is a way to provide information in a different fashion, or that, as I mentioned earlier, that the science that we're trying to do and the understanding that we're trying to bring is always tied to a question, right? But maybe we're not asking the right question. And so I think we have to create a dialogue to understand what the questions are. I'm actually also part of what's called the coupled model into comparison project. I'm actually chairing it, and that's what a lot of those simulations that we're talking about here are generated by this group. And we're just about to send a survey. We're really going to try to reach all the practitioners and all the people who are using this information to get a better understanding of what is really needed. So I think we're realizing that there is a need for information, and so we need to maximize and optimize the generation of information. So I know this is more an answer into the future, but I think we're starting to find a path, and having everyone included is really, to me, the answer to this path. Right? Well, Chris, I'm sure has that.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Thanks. That's a really, really important question you asked there, because I think there are two parts to it. The first is, or two responses rather. The first is, how do we formulate the question that is actually being asked? So what are the important factors that policymakers really do want answers to? And very often within CSAG, we've done a lot of the co-production, co-exploration work that John Fois mentioned over the last 7 years, particularly in a project called Fractal, where we worked with these different cities. And we found that we spent really the first couple of years of that project working with the policymakers to understand actually what are the important things in their context, so their city contexts. And from there, we start thinking about, okay, so now what do we need to look at in the climate context to address what is important to you? Usually it's done the opposite way around, and I think this is incorrectly done, where you start with the climate and then you take it to the policymaker or whoever your audience is, whoever you're working with. And what we really try and promote now is to avoid making mistakes right at the beginning, is to have that discussion first, so that you understand what the question is. And by you, I mean everyone, the policymaker, the climate scientist, whoever's doing maybe hydrology or agriculture modeling, and working together as a community to co-explore and co-produce relevant information that can then inform policy. Also, we don't make policy. As scientists, we're not good at policy. We leave that to the policy folk.
Thank you. That was a fabulous question, a really important question, and it touches on a topic I wanted to raise, and we'll probably have to continue the discussion in other ways in the future. But one of the things that we've also observed in SilverLining in looking at climate models, climate data, is that there's a lot more work that's done focused on the places that have access to the capabilities. So there's lots of rich information on the United States and Europe. There's more observational data. The climate models are doing more sophisticated representation of those areas, and maybe some weaknesses or holes in other parts of the world. And so by kind of opening this up, hopefully too, maybe we fill some gaps. And I wonder if you guys see that as well from your perspective.
So the models are global in nature, right? So they try to represent things as well as they can everywhere. But But I think it is clear that we don't always have the local information, the local knowledge, or the regional knowledge to really look at how good the models are there. And this is what we need to do to make sure the models get better and better over time. And also, I mean, the information that we put in model is based on the knowledge that we have of what's happening in the real world. And so there's plenty of places for which we might not have an understanding of how the vegetation will respond, how the hydrology that Chris is mentioning, we just don't have that information at this point. So that's a really good connection, yes.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Maybe just one nuance on that, Kelly, is that if a paper came out 2 or 3 days ago, colleagues of mine at University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa wrote this paper, and they looked at who is doing research in Africa, so climate research in Africa. And they found that 58% of papers that they reviewed did not have a single African author on it. So if we get this climate right, if we manage to do analyses and actually do this correctly, it capacitates us as African and developing nation researchers to actually do the research for our own countries, our own places. And what the paper they wrote was, it really, I didn't quite cry, but I was really sad to understand that in 58% of the papers about climate over Africa, there is not an African author or co-author even. So that's what this is trying to do. We really need to try and capacitate African and developing nation scientists to produce the science for their own places.
That's quite extraordinary, Chris. Thank you for sharing that. That's a really striking piece of information. That one of the big gaps is that the studies that there are not being done by people in the region. That's really, really quite extraordinary. So I want to take the opportunity now to thank you all for sharing this. If you are interested in more information on this program, on the work that they're doing at NCART with climate modeling at the University of Cape Town, you can start by going to silverlining.ngo. And you can contact us through the website to get specific information and specific contacts that we will help you connect with regarding all of these programs, which we're happy to share. There's also information on the website about this specific program and this sort of novel climate model generation on the cloud and the kinds of near-term climate problems and climate responses that people are looking at. So we'd be very happy to have you contact us, and we'd be very happy to have you visit the website. I want to thank each of our panelists today for sharing this, and a special thanks to them for their work on this problem. These efforts, actually, all of the people here on the panel have essentially contributed their resources in various ways to doing this type of novel study on the cloud. And the type of technical innovation that is taken to make it work. And so we're really excited at what this might mean for accelerating science and making it accessible and bringing new dynamics and new talent to looking at these problems. So I want to thank you all for spending time listening and sharing. And we will look forward to more conversations of this kind in the future. Thank you very much and have a terrific rest of the day.